Okay, so hi everybody, thanks so much for coming. My name is Bethany Hughley, and I am president of the mental health group here at Robson Hall. I'm very excited to be welcoming Mr. Orlando De Silva on behalf of both the faculty and the mental health group today. Mr. De Silva has been practicing various types of law in Toronto for 24 years. He was the president of the Ontario Bar Association from 2014 to 2015, and he has also experienced struggles with mental health. Over the last year, he's been sharing his experience and advice with law students across Canada. We're very grateful to have Mr. De Silva here today. Law school and the legal profession are environments in which mental illness and other mental health struggles thrive. There's also a culture of trying to put your best foot forward, so many lawyers and law students feel it's difficult to speak about what they're going through. Therefore, we really appreciate Mr. De Silva's willingness to be open and to talk about his personal experience and to hear his advice for us as we make our way through law school and enter the legal profession. So please join me in welcoming Mr. De Silva.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for that kind introduction and for your hospitality today. I'm so delighted to be here at the University of Manitoba at Robson Hall. It seems like a very historic law school. My first time here, I had a chance to walk around a little bit and get a sense of what the school feels like. And it's been a great opportunity on this tour that I've been doing to do that across the country. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to law students about mental health is that I've been getting a lot of messages on social media. I've been talking about mental wellness in the legal profession for about 5 years now, since I was president of the OBA and first revealed after 37 years my own struggles with depression and, in fact, a suicide attempt back in 2008. And that's meant in part that people have reached out to me, and I've been hearing a lot about the great stress that you're experiencing, and I try to time this talk just before exams and just after reading week. So I'm hearing too, of course, about debt stress. Some schools, the tuitions are very high. My alma mater is U of T, and of course that's, approaching $40,000 a year now. Job competition is tight in Ontario. I'm learning that there's about 1.7 students to 2 students for every articling position. And importantly, I'm also hearing a lot about imposter syndrome, this feeling that students are having that, that you feel like you're a fraud or a fake. They're here just by happenstance. The LSAT was a fluke. Everything you've done in your life was lucky, and one day you're going to be found out and invited to find something else to do with your life. I want to say in part that you're not alone, that students across the country feel that way. And if you roll back the clock about 25, 30 years, students felt the same way back then, except we didn't talk about it. We didn't have wellness committees or staff available to talk to and counseling. Partly because of the generation. You guys are way further ahead than we were back then, but also I think just talking about it the way we have with Bell Let's Talk Day and other initiatives to reduce stigma has made it a bit easier. If nothing else comes across to you today in the next hour or so, I want you to feel this at least, that you are more than your grades. No matter what happens in the weeks to come, you are more than your grades. You have so much to offer. You've already accomplished so much in your life just to be a student in law school. And we need you, your community needs you, and you'll find one day that your country needs you, especially when we need reminders about the rule of law and how important it is to our democracy. I have learned over the last 5 years that talking about fostering mental wellness in the profession doesn't really get started unless you start as a leader in the profession with a big reveal of your own. And for me, that reveal is that I struggle with major depression and dysthymia. And as I mentioned, I've had a suicide attempt. Now I want to give you a trigger warning here. I'm going to talk about these events in some detail because it's an important part of who I am and what I've become and what I want to convey through the next hour, which ultimately is a message of hope, which is to say that you can suffer through these things and still have a meaningful and fulfilling life and career in law. It's not going to stop you. So if details about my suicide attempt you feel will result in intrusive thoughts or will trigger you in some way, please feel free to leave. You will not be offending me. I understand that this happens sometimes. I have spoken about my struggles with depression now over 200 times across Canada and into the United States. Face to face, I estimate maybe 20,000 people have heard it. If you count social media and traditional media and radio, print, and all that, I'm told by the Law Society of Ontario's action force on the access to justice that it's reached over 6 million people. So I'm only mentioning this to say that you'd be forgiven to think that this has become quite routine for me, that it's easy to do, you know. In fact, it's not. I find it very difficult. I feel very raw talking about it. I feel embarrassed talking about it still. And it takes me usually 2 to 3 days to recover from going through it because it has a way, in fact, of being self-triggering. But I do it to try to be helpful, to try to make it easier for others to talk. One of the reasons, though, that this embarrassment comes over me is in part from the fact that as a lawyer and for so many other reasons, I am the beneficiary of a lot of privilege. And so I'm asked often, and some of you will probably be asked as well and may have already, what on earth do you have to be depressed about, you know? And that kind of point or question, it comes to me like its own intrusive thought. You know, I ask myself that all the time, and it was reinforced during a period in my career when I was doing Indigenous litigation. And Attawapiskat was prominent in the news across the country and in fact around the world, and you know, we still hear about it. And in particular, what has prompted the chief of Attawapiskat to declare what seems to be a perpetual state of emergency, reflecting the fact that there is an incomprehensibly high suicide rate and attempted suicide rate, especially amongst its youngest members, children as young as 9 and 11. There were stories of suicide pacts being made amongst children. Now, as most of you probably know, Attawapiskat is in the James Bay Drainage Basin in a spectacularly beautiful part of this country. But its beauty is clouded by very complex social problems like overcrowding and bullying and lack of supports, both physically, medically, and for mental health supports, which when you take it all together has driven up the mental health issues and depression and anxiety and this attempted suicide rate to incomprehensible levels. Now, Attawapiskat isn't alone. There are many other First Nation communities and other communities across the country that are facing the same kind of trauma. the same kind of suffering. And as a father of 3 daughters, I try to imagine being a parent in one of these communities and experiencing this paralyzing parental fear for your children growing up where there is a state of emergency over their mental health. So my heart cries out for these communities, especially for its children. But their suffering makes me feel foolish and embarrassed, admitting that I struggle with depression at all. There is no apparent reason for it. Now, there's always food on my table. My tap water is always safe to drink. I have a good income. I've got a good job. You may not know this, but over the 24 years I've worked in the private sector, became partner at a big firm, worked in the public sector for the last 13 years, and now I'm a prosecutor with the Serious Fraud Office, All of these are great things. I've got a great family. So what on earth could I be depressed about? There's so many people in our communities and across the country who have it worse off, and that is objectively and demonstrably true. But it's a hard truth to reconcile with major depression and how it affects me. And I say to myself, in a self-stigmatizing kind of way, what does it say about me? What does it say about the kind of person I am? Why can't I just snap out of it, like so often I'm told to do? Why can't I appreciate all of the good in my life, all of these good things that I just listed? Why can't I appreciate them all of the time? Where's my gratitude? The point is that depression doesn't necessarily have much to do with your personal circumstances. Poverty, bullying, overcrowding, these things can cause depression. Chronic pain can cause depression. The wealth, status, privilege isn't necessarily the cure. Mental illness is so much more complex than that. Now, although many still believe that mental illness is an affliction that's limited to the weak, the homeless, the poor, the neglected, and the abused, the reality is that it can affect anyone, anywhere, at any time. And you may not know it's coming. It can come on fast. No one is immune, and that's borne out by the empirical data and the research. One reason that I focused on depression in the justice system, and lawyers in particular, is the paradox that lawyers, as privileged as they seem in society, are still 4 times more likely to suffer from depression than the rest of society. According to a Johns Hopkins study, it's becoming quite dated now. In 1991, the American Bar Association came up with a study that I think they published in 2017, 2018, that showed that of the 1,000 respondents in the United States, the depression and anxiety levels are so high that, in a surprising statistic itself, 20% of respondents have admitted to self-medicating using illegal drugs. That astonishes me. 20% of respondents are using illegal drugs. Lawyers are ranked 4th amongst professionals that die by suicide. Dentists are 1st, pharmacists are 2nd, and physicians are 3rd. And if you think about it for a minute, those top 3 have easy access, or easier access than lawyers do, to the means to end their lives. And ironically and counterintuitively, a recent study from the University of Toronto out of the Faculty of Sociology has found that the more successful lawyers are, the more depressed they are. And when they're looking at success in that study, they're looking at the traditional stereotypical markers like income and status, elite law schools, elite clerkships, and elite law firms. So the more of that that's been achieved in a career, the more depressed that career person is. And the authors think that, it's due in part to the high competition and high conflict environment that we work in. If you think about it, lawyers really earn their living on conflict. And I know there were times when I was a partner at a big firm, Borden Ladner Gervais in Toronto, that it seemed like people were mad all of the time. It was, you know, your fellow partners or colleagues, your spouse, your clients, and you couldn't avoid it. But the fact that these successful lawyers, the more successful, more depressed, seems to be also true in part because to be successful, you have to give up a lot of what makes you happy. You know, there used to be a joke that, probably half a joke, that, you know, you could take as much vacation as you wanted as long as you met your target, which was to say you couldn't take any vacation at all. You know, and meeting your target wasn't enough. You had to exceed your target. So you had to give up a lot of the things that made you happy, like vacations, like downtime, like family time. Friendships would suffer, your hobbies would suffer. And doctors in the medical field, they're experiencing the same kinds of issues. I do talks with them as well. According to Dr. Andy Benjamin out of the University of Washington, by third year of law school, 40% of the class will have suffered a diagnosable mental illness, mostly depression and to a lesser extent anxiety disorder. And he suggests it's due to the competition of law school. Perfectionism is a great enemy to your mental well-being. Grade stress, like I talked about early on, debt, student debt, job competition, type A personalities, and this pessimism that you either develop when you're in law school or law school attracts pessimistic students. They're not sure which, but which is also rewarded once you become a lawyer. Maybe cynicism is a good word as well. But it's the ability, in my mind, on the practical level, to identify where the catastrophe is going to come in your file. And when you're a solicitor, to try to avoid that catastrophe. And when that catastrophe happens, as a litigator, to find out who to blame or how to defend. So that pessimism, cynicism, and catastrophizing is part of the problem, but part of the profession as well. In terms of the general population, 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a diagnosed mental illness at some point in their life. Today, 500,000 people called in sick because of mental illness, mostly depression, costing the Canadian economy somewhere between $27 and $50 billion a year in lost productivity. In the United States, there are 110 suicides a day. There's more suicides in the States than homicides. It's 1 every 13 minutes. There's an attempt every time you blink your eyes. In Canada, at this very moment, some 3 million Canadians are suffering from major depression, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association. Yet, the Royal Bank of Canada's insurance survey found in 2018, and this just fall, that half of Canadians, just under half, 47%, do not view depression as a disability. Certainly not like a physical ailment. So, one of the results of that is that 2 out of 3 Canadians will suffer with depression and anxiety without telling anybody at all, without getting any help, because they're afraid of judgment and rejection. And for good reason. You know, the most important statistic to me, the one that I think I only need to ever refer to because it motivates me, according to the Canadian Medical Association, only 49% of Canadians said that they would socialize with a friend who has a serious mental illness. So I want to highlight the word friend in there. Only 49% would socialize with a friend they had a serious mental illness. That's it to say that as soon as you publicly disclose that you have depression or anxiety, you're going to lose half of your friends. So despite all that we do and all that we've done, the stigma is still so intense. you know. Beyond the statistics, though, there's one anecdote that really makes it real for me. In fact, I can't forget it, even if I wanted to. Like I said, I've given a lot of these talks, and some of them are to very large audiences, and one was to a group of about 1,500 people. And afterwards, a woman came up to me as I was about to leave, and sometimes people talk and want to reflect with me or talk to me about how mental illness has touched their lives in some way, either directly or indirectly. And I had already had about a dozen people talk to me, and so she lingered for another 45 minutes, and I kind of gestured toward her and said, you know, come on over. And she came to me, she might have been in her mid-40s, it was April 2016, and she said, I don't know how to tell you this, but I lost my daughter 4 months ago. She was 14 years old. She took her own life just before Christmas of 2015. And she didn't tell me anything more about herself, didn't tell me her name, she didn't tell me her daughter's name. But she wanted me to know and not to leave that room without knowing that her daughter left a suicide note. And I'm sure it said other things, but there was one sentence that she wanted me to walk away with, and that was, her daughter wrote in the note, "Please, Mom, don't tell anybody." In a sentence, that tells me still how powerful and insidious the stigma is. I want to fight that stigma. I want us all to fight it, here at Robson Hall and across the country. And I want us to beat the living daylights out of it. I'm challenged by a condition called dysthymia, which is a chronic low-grade depression that for me escalates into a major depressive episode every 3 to 4 years, starting when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My childhood depression was never diagnosed as depression. It was back in the 70s and people just, it wasn't on the radar. It looked more like I was a shy or introverted kid. You know, maybe too serious, something I heard a lot when I was a kid. I was just too serious. You know, but as a child, and even as an adult, you don't think that the pain that you're suffering, the thing that's driving you to feel isolating, self-isolating, is the result of a mental illness, or the irrationality born of a depressed mind. You know, rather, you just think you are, as a person, as a human being, a worthless boy. You believe you are a worthless boy. And then one day a worthless teenager, and in my case, a worthless man. You don't diagnose yourself with depression, you just believe you're worthless. My grade 4 teacher, Mrs. Forster, thought it was more than just shyness or introversion. And so she tried to help me with asking me to keep what she called a happy book. Today might be called a gratitude journal. And she'd ask me to write in it everything that made me happy in a day, and at the end of the week we'd talk about it. And that extra attention and care meant the world to me and helped me recover some self-confidence and self-worth. You know, but grade 4 ended. Summer came and went, and grade 5 started, and with it, the depression came back, and like the shadowy companion that it is, it's never left me. It only subsides and intensifies and subsides regularly throughout my life. And it stayed with me even, as I grew older and matured, even as I enjoyed some success in life. Didn't matter, I became the editor-in-chief of the Law Review at U of T, still hit by a depressive cycle. I became partner at Borden Ladner, I was still hit by a depressive cycle, president of the Bar Association in Ontario. That wasn't a cure for my depression either. My mood would always oscillate between this chronic low-grade depression, the dysthymia, and a major depressive cycle. Like I said, every 3 to 4 years, almost like clockwork. And I would always, in those times, feel like an imposter. Like I was going to get found out. My LSAT was a fluke. My grades, my accomplishments, everything I had done was luck. Everything I failed is what I deserved and reflected my true ability. Now, each one of these major depressive episodes, when they got to their worst point, would always look the same, which was to say, at night, usually, at work it'd be different, but at night I'd come home and I'd isolate myself, and I'd be deliberately isolating myself, and I would think of nothing else but my own mortality. I'd think about dying. I'd think about the relief of dying. I'd be thinking of ways to kill myself. Sometimes I would make plans to do it. And I would focus and ruminate on these things until I was overcome with exhaustion. And I'd fall asleep. I'd wake up early and go to work. And I would repeat that cycle every day for anywhere from 6 to 18 months. Like the tides, this depression would always subside and I would return to better days. And these better days were, that stable but low-grade depression, this dysthymia. Something akin to an equilibrium, I think, in my mind, between despair, almost like a life-ending feeling of despair, and relief from that despair. It was always teetering. Never knew when it would tip in one direction or the other. But I never felt joy. Never felt happiness. Mostly I didn't feel anything at all. Just a complete numbness. But the important point out of that, in trying to describe the feeling of depression, which isn't sadness, it's like a lack of vitality, a lack of life in you, is that no one could tell I was depressed at all. I was very, as they say, high functioning. It didn't visibly affect me. I learned, I suppose, to disguise it. Ever since I was a child, intense, serious, hardworking, determined. There's a new thing I've been hearing called smiling depression, where people will look happy, but they're hiding the depression. I don't think I have smiling depression. It just doesn't work for me. Never been a good smiler. So the quality of my work never suffered despite these depressive episodes. In fact, the more depressed I was, the harder I worked. Work was like a distraction, right? The biggest, most fundamental distraction. Maybe I was more afraid of failure than I was of the depression. But I knew that the affirmation you got from a job well done helped me feel a bit better. The pat on the back, or the success and achievement, as if those successes and achievements, like partnership, president of the OBA, all these things that I mentioned, would be a cure to my depression, would fill that void, and I'd finally say, I've made it, I'm going to be okay. Now this phenomenon, this high-functioning depression, reminds me of something my friend, Dr. Jane Story, past president of the Ontario Psychological Association, said once on a panel discussion. And that was that we, as lawyers, are great at functioning at work and elsewhere when we're not even coping with our own moods and mental health. So they're not mutually exclusive. And in that vein, I continued to function throughout my career to achieve things, success or achievements by all outward appearances. I never missed a beat. I never missed a deadline. A client wasn't unhappy with the work product. The worrisome takeaway for those of you in the room who don't suffer from depression, believe you never will, is that you may never know who amongst you are suffering. They may look completely fine. You know, you may not know your friends or family or colleagues, the people in your row are suffering from depression, especially the highest functioning amongst them. For the best and the brightest amongst us, the last thing that goes is school or work. You know, the thing that distracts them from their mental health issues. And when you start to see signs of it at school, at work, which is like withdrawal and isolation, a lack of concentration, maybe listlessness, some kind of escapist behavior that you would normally see, a door that's closed that's usually open, it's bad for them. They need help. They're probably not going to ask for it. They may need an intervention. Most likely, I'm afraid, you're not going to notice anything at all. One of the reasons I'm doing this cross-country tour is because that very thing happened to me just this early February. I had a friend who I practiced with for 10 years. We went our separate ways in practice. He continued in the private sector, and I went into the public sector back in 2005. But on Super Bowl Sunday, I got a call and learned that he had died by suicide. And of course, the person, a family friend who called me, and actually a former colleague at work, was distraught. And she called me because of the work that I do outside of the office on mental health, and told me that nobody knew he suffered from depression. Nobody knew. And of course, I didn't know either. And it's easy to beat yourself up about this stuff because, you know, I think, my God, he knows me. I talk about this stuff. Why wouldn't he say anything? Well, you know, yeah. Can't help it. Or maybe we can help it by making it easier to talk about. But it tells me there's still a lot of work to do. My illness, like most, I think, is, you know, mental isn't really an accurate description to me as much as a brain illness, because there's a physical, observable component to it. You can use a like a CT scan to see the brain activity, and it'll show you what a depressed brain looks like. It'll show you an overactive limbic system, which corresponds with feelings of sadness and moodiness, appetite changes up and down, and suicidal ideation. It'll show you that you have an underactive prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of the brain, and that regulates your organizational skills and your judgment. And if it's underactive, you tend to be more impulsive. So if you combined impulsivity with suicidal ideation in a depressed mind, you have a potentially lethal combination. I've learned by talking to experts over the years that suicides are mostly impulsive acts. You know, there are TED Talks about, you may want to go online and see at some point, about the Golden Gate Bridge, There have been 2,000 plus suicides off the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's an officer who, for 20 plus years, patrolled that part of the San Francisco Oakwood area. And only 1% have ever survived. And invariably, he told me that for those that did survive, they told him they regretted it as soon as they let go. Other brain imaging devices will show that a long and unrelenting period of depression will decrease brain function. The hypothalamus, for example, which is like an almond-shaped size organ in the brain, in the limbic system, will shrink by as much as 20% following a long depressive episode. The other point to bear in mind is that depression and anxiety and other mental health issues are often passed on from generation to generation. Even intergenerational trauma can pass on depression. So parents or grandparents have suffered from some trauma in their life. Their descendants can experience depression as a result of that trauma that they didn't directly experience. And I can take my own family as an example. My father's family suffered from severe major depression. Every one of them in his immediate family suffered. He self-medicated with alcohol until he died at the age of 51. His sister attempted suicide using violent means 3 times before she passed away at the age of 76. Their grandfather ended his life at the age of 48. I'm going to be my father's age when he died next month. But my brush with death came about 10 years ago when I was 40 years old. It was at that time, basically May of 2007, I was invited to consider running for the Liberal nomination for the federal election that was coming up in 2008. And I decided to give it a try. And for those of you who are involved in politics, you know, like to win a nomination for a riding, you got to sell memberships in the party to people who will pledge to vote for you at a nomination meeting. And if you can sell more and get more people out to the meeting to vote for you, you win the nomination and you become the candidate. Now, I was living in Mississauga at the time. I was working in downtown Toronto, and I was working full-time. Coming back home to Mississauga, I would quickly change into something more casual, and then I would drive the 2 hours to where I grew up in Kitchener. And then I would go knocking door to door until about 9:15, 9:30 at night. Back in the car, back home, and then back to work. And I did that every day including all weekend long, between May of 2007 and November 2007, when I had accumulated enough memberships that my opponent dropped out of the race and I was acclaimed. So the good news was that I won the nomination. The bad news was that perhaps in part because of this, devotion to winning the nomination and to working and putting all of my time into that, I lost my marriage. I came home one day and found that my wife had moved out. And I dealt with it, I think, like a lot of people deal with trauma or sadness or difficult events in their life. I buried it. I didn't think about it. I sort of put it in a compartment and said, I'm going to distract myself with a single-minded determination to win this election whenever it happens. And when I win this election, I'll have achieved something and this feeling will go away. So over the next 18 months or so, I worked harder than I'd have ever worked in my life, either before or since. I knocked on over 20,000 doors. I had a team of volunteers. I had signs all over the city. And I had televised debates. It was one of those bellwether ridings that meant that the leader, Stefan Dion, Bob Ray, Michael Ignatieff would all visit the riding. We'd have events, and it was a big deal and a big distraction. But then election day came, and I lost by 11,000 votes. I like to think I came in second. You know, like the silver medalist, maybe, of Kitchener-Conestoga. But what surprised me then, and still in some ways surprises me, is how quickly it all ends, you know. Perhaps driven by some bylaw or regulation, all of the signs are gone within 24 hours. Your campaign office shuts down, all of the volunteers disperse, your team disperses, and the hope and excitement, anticipation, and the future that you had painted for yourself are all gone. And once they were all gone, I didn't have that distraction anymore, and I had to come across that brick wall of a marriage that ended and the grief that it caused me at the time. And like many men, I suppose, the only person I had to talk about my feelings with was no longer available to me. It was my wife. And so I tried to deal with it on my own, with no success. I was living at that point in a one-bedroom apartment near Conestoga College. It was a student apartment. You know, I had a house, a 5-bedroom house in Mississauga, and then because of the marriage and all that, I was now in the riding, but in this dreary place, and I started to feel foolish for losing. You know, I deserved to lose, in other words. And then I started to feel, as the narrative continued to spiral downward, that I was foolish for trying, and that I'd embarrassed myself, and I embarrassed my community, and I embarrassed my family. The cycle continued downward in my mind, and I began to feel that I didn't deserve the career I had. Didn't deserve to be a lawyer. Didn't deserve to have any respect, any friends. Certainly no love. And perhaps dangerous of all, most dangerous of all, is I didn't think I deserved any help. And I started to think that the world would be better off, or the people that loved me would be better off if I wasn't in the world. You know, I remember when Robin Williams died, and a lot of celebrities, when they die, some other celebrity will say, you know, they just committed the most selfish act you can commit. I'm not sorry for them. You know, they were thinking only of their own pain and not the pain that they were causing, or that their act caused the people they left behind. But I know that being in that moment, what's on your mind is that this is the greatest act of love, because I'm depriving the people I love of the decrepit, burdensome human being that I had become. And their lives would be better for it. So late one night, after work, I stopped at the pharmacy to get my prescription for sleep medication. You know, you can imagine with these ruminating thoughts, I was having insomnia. And for some reason, they gave me a 6-month supply all at once. So I had a big bottle of 180 sleeping pills. And I went home, and I was still in my suit. I sat up at my computer, booted it up, and logged in, and started taking the sleeping pills, because all I wanted to do was be unconscious. When I was sleeping was the only time I didn't feel pain. And I started drinking, opened up a bottle of wine. By 11:30 at night, the pills were gone, the bottles were empty. I'd consumed 180 sleeping pills in the space of about 180 to 200 minutes. And I remember thinking in that moment that tonight I was going to die. In fact, it may be in only a few minutes. And I remember thinking, I don't care. And then I pushed myself from my desk, fell flat on the floor, and my phone fell in front of me and hit my thumb. And then I thought, I can't send a message to anybody. I can't write a note, obviously. I can't even see. Can't see the buttons on the phone. It was an old BlackBerry. And I thought, I can't say goodbye to my daughter. No way to do that. And then I thought, I don't want to say goodbye to my daughter. So I pressed a button on the phone, and by happenstance, it happened to be the speed dial to my estranged wife. Couldn't speak, could only garble something out. It was enough to alarm her, and she called 911. And I spent the next 6 months in hospital. But I didn't tell anybody. I was in 6 months in the hospital over Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, the whole thing, my mother's birthday, because I was so afraid of the stigma, you know. If word got out, what would people think of me? I wouldn't get the trials I was used to getting. You know, my family would love me less. Clients wouldn't give me the tough cases that they can't fight on their own. You know, who gives a trial to someone they think is weak? But nothing cries out weakness and vulnerability more than depression and anxiety and the inability to overcome it alone. I tried to gain some wisdom through this. There's an ancient Greek poem that helped me, written by Aeschylus in 2,500 years ago. It says, even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And the wisdom that I tried to gain was, how do I become intuitive so that I don't let myself fall this low again? It resulted in a 10-point scale that I still use today, where 10 is like a feeling that a happiness I've never felt before. 8 would be the best I've ever felt. 6, my dysthymic normal, my cruising altitude. 5 is the onset of problems, where I start to lose interest in hobbies. And 3, a decline so severe that I need someone to help me. I can't think my way out of it anymore. I can't help myself. I can't will it away. So the insight, the wisdom that I gain is that I can't let myself fall below a 3 again. To understand what a 3 feels like, I've tried to put it into words but can't. The best I could come up with was something that resonated with me in my 20s when I read A Tale of Two Cities for the first time. Charles Dickens was describing a sunrise in what I thought was an odd way. He said, sadly, sadly, the sun rose. It rose upon no sadder sight than the man of good abilities and good emotions, incapable of their directed exercise, incapable of his own help or happiness, sensible about the blight upon him, and resigning himself to let it eat him away. And it occurred to me that if that's how you feel, if that's how you've ever felt, you're at a 3 or below. And you can't, at that point, help yourself. You need someone to help you. So how do you know? How do they know that you're at a 3 or below when all you want to do is isolate yourself? When isolation is the worst thing for you, deprives you of the vital connections to do more and to be more and to love and to be loved. And left unchecked, it can persuade you, the intelligent, successful, admired person that you are, to seek that permanent solution to what is often a temporary problem. But you can't get that help unless you speak up. Tell somebody about your own 10-point scale. And to do that, we have to chip away at the stigma, to make it easier to talk about. Even knowing this, I still kept my suicide attempt secret for another 6 years, until I became president of the Bar Association. So in chipping away at the stigma, I want you to try to internalize the fact that, as Michael Landsberg said, that depression and anxiety is an illness. It's not a weakness. It doesn't relegate you to a dull, unproductive, and meaningless life. And think of the people who we know historically and the people who said even recently that they suffer from depression and anxiety. And think of all of the things they contribute and have given to this world. Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Michael Phelps, a man with 28 Olympic medals, has self-worth issues. Alec Baldwin, Beyonce, John Bon Jovi, Truman Capote, Johnny Carson, Leonard Cohen, Ernest Hemingway, just named 2 Nobel Prize laureates. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Billy Joel, Angelina Jolie, and Mozart. From the achievements and meanings of all of these lived experiences, I want you to feel hope for yourself and for your loved ones, and I want to give compassion to yourself and your loved ones and colleagues. And I want you to continue to do that when you go out and work in the profession and when you become leaders yourselves. Be compassionate to the people that you lead. We can't afford to lose the talent and contribution of these people, of all of us who suffer from depression and anxiety. I have known in my journey over the last several years of speaking about it publicly and knowing people with depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues, that they are among the strongest people I have ever known. My only hope, it seems to me, is a modest one, and that is somehow we can collaborate together as colleagues to keep people from suffering in silence throughout the justice system and across our country. In other words, I want to be able to demonstrate by example that if I can do this, disclose the undisclosable and still walk out that door without appearing weak and vulnerable, without losing my reputation, without facing ridicule, scorn, and judgment, then maybe you can tell somebody if you're feeling depressed or have anxiety, or show compassion to someone else who thinks they are, and create a space around you where we can talk about this stuff without fear of ridicule, scorn, or judgment. And you can use me as an example. 10 years after a suicide attempt, I'm still alive. For me, that's a mic drop moment, especially with my family history. My family loves me. I have a great career and great colleagues, and somehow I was entrusted with the presidency of the OBA. I got remarried. I have 3 wonderful daughters, and in this moment, on this sunny day, on the Red River at Robson Hall, I get to share my time with you. A few moments ago, I told you that I'd taken 180 pills and 2 bottles of wine. Some years ago, I learned that the lethal dose for someone my size is 30 tablets. So I'd taken 6 times the lethal dose. I should have died. And I am so happy I didn't succeed. I am so happy I didn't die. Because in the decade that followed, if I had died, I would never have learned how rich and rewarding my career would be, how fulfilling and meaningful my life would become. And I would never have learned of everything that is beautiful in this world from my wife and my daughters. And I believe that gratitude will one day save me. But for now, and forever, the battle continues. And if we're all fighting to end this stigma, I'm looking forward to the battles to come. Thank you so much for your attention.